I mailed my wedding invitation 6 months early. 2 weeks later, my younger sister scheduled her engagement party for the exact same day. On what should have been the happiest day of my life, I stood in a silent ballroom while my entire family celebrated on a yacht across the city. They believed they had finally broken me. But while scrolling through social media, I noticed my sister wearing something that didn't belong to her. That was when they forgot one thing: before I was a bride, I was a forensic accountant, and I knew exactly where every secret was buried. You're about to hear a story about boundaries, accountability, and choosing yourself. If this resonates with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Please note before we continue, this narrative includes fictionalized elements used to convey a broader lesson. Any similarities to real names or situations are coincidental, but the message is intentional. My name is Nia, and at 32 years old, I make a living finding hidden money and exposing fraud. It requires patience, precision, and a heart that does not break easily. I thought I had built a fortress around my life in Atlanta, away from the toxicity of my parents Marcus and Vivian. I was wrong. The silence in the St. Regis ballroom was deafening. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting light on 10 round tables, set with imported linens and white orchids. Every single seat at those tables was empty. My fiancé Dante stood by the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, but his jaw was clenched tight. He ran a cybersecurity firm and was the only person who truly understood the war I had been fighting my whole life. He walked down the aisle not to meet me but to hold my hand. His grip was warm and solid against my cold fingers. "They are not coming, are they?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. He was talking about the 100 guests from my side, my aunts, my cousins, my family friends. Even the pastor looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot while checking his watch. I did not answer him immediately. My phone, which I had kept hidden in the pocket of my wedding dress, vibrated against my thigh. It had been buzzing incessantly for the last hour, not with calls from concerned relatives wondering where to park, but with notifications. I pulled it out. The screen was bright with an Instagram live stream notification. "Bianca is live." My thumb hovered over the screen. Bianca was my 27-year-old sister, the influencer, the golden child, the woman who had never worked a day in her life, yet lived in a penthouse apartment my parents paid for. I clicked the notification. The video loaded instantly. The scene was chaotic and loud. A DJ was blasting music, champagne corks were popping. The camera panned around the deck of a luxury yacht, showing the Atlanta skyline in the background. And there they were. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, holding court, laughing with glasses of expensive scotch in their hands. My aunts and uncles, who had declined my invitation citing illness or travel issues, were dancing in the background. Then the camera found Bianca. She was laughing, her head thrown back, clinging to the arm of her fiancé Chase. He was a nice enough guy from old money, the kind of connection my parents had salivated over for decades. But I did not look at Chase. I looked at what Bianca was wearing. My breath caught in my throat. It was a vintage Christian Dior gown, cream-colored silk taffeta, with a hand-beaded bodice. My grandmother had bought that dress in Paris in 1958. She had left it to me in her will, specifically to me. It was the one heirloom I treasured above all else. 2 weeks ago, it had vanished from the back of my closet. When I had called my mother in a panic, she had sworn up and down that I must have misplaced it or that the dry cleaner had lost it. She had even chastised me for being so careless with a family treasure. Lies. All lies. There it was on my sister's body, tailored to fit her frame wine, already sloshing dangerously close to the delicate silk. My vision blurred, not with tears, but with a red-hot rage that started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. Just as the live stream ended, a text message popped up on my screen. It was from my mother, Vivian. "Stop calling your aunts. We are at a very important event for Bianca. Chase's grandmother is here and we need to make a good impression. Do not be selfish, Nia. Your sister needs this dress to look the part." You can have your little ceremony any weekend, but this is a social event. We will send a gift later. Don't be selfish. The phrase echoed in my head. I looked at the empty tables. I looked at the thousands of dollars of flowers that would die unseen. I looked at Dante, who was reading the text over my shoulder, his face darkening with fury. I realized then that this was never about a schedule conflict. This was a statement. They were telling me exactly where I stood. I was the bank account, the problem solver, the invisible daughter. Bianca was the star. I took a deep breath, and the scent of expensive lilies filled my lungs. I did not cry. Crying was for the girl I used to be. The woman I had become did not get sad. She got even. I looked up at Dante, and for the first time that day, I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile I wore when I found a hidden offshore account during an audit. Do it, I said, my voice steady and cold. Dante looked at me surprised. Are you sure, Nia? Once we start this, there is no going back. I looked at the phone one last time at the frozen image of my sister wearing my grandmother's legacy, while my mother smirked in the background. I thought about the mortgage papers I had reviewed 3 months ago. I thought about the shell company I had quietly established. I thought about the clause in the trust fund documents that my parents had never bothered to read. I am sure, I said. Call the lawyer. Tell him to activate Clause 4B immediately. I want the asset seizure to begin before they even get off that boat. Dante nodded, pulling out his phone. I turned to the pastor, who looked terrified by the change in atmosphere. Reverend, I said, smoothing the skirt of my backup wedding dress. Let us proceed. I have a marriage to start and a family to evict. The ceremony proceeded with the clinical precision of a business transaction rather than the warmth of a union. I stood before the altar holding Dante's hands and repeated the vows I had written months ago. They were supposed to be words of softness, but today they felt like armor plating, protecting what little heart I had left, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish. The echo in the empty ballroom was my only witness, aside from the few friends who had looked at me with pity. I did not want pity. I wanted justice. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, there was no roar of applause, just the polite clapping of 12 pairs of hands. We walked back down the aisle, not to a reception line of hugging relatives, but to a silent room where the air conditioning hummed too loudly against the quiet. The cake cutting was the final absurdity. A 5-tier masterpiece of vanilla bean and raspberry filling designed to feed 200 people stood like a monument to my naivety. I sliced into the bottom layer, the knife scraping against the cardboard base with a harsh sound. Dante placed his hand over mine, guiding the blade. We fed each other small bites of sweetness that tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at the empty chairs where my mother and father should have been sitting and felt the last tether of obligation snap within my chest. Across the city, on the deck of the yacht, the atmosphere was shifting from celebration to panic. I was not there, but I knew exactly what was happening because I had orchestrated it. My mother, Vivian, was likely snapping her fingers at a server demanding another bottle of Dom Perignon for Chase's grandmother. She would have handed over her Platinum American Express, the one she flashed like a badge of honor. But this time the machine would not beep with approval. It would buzz with a rejection. I imagined the color draining from her face beneath her layers of expensive foundation. She would try again. Maybe she would pull out the Visa or the MasterCard. Declined. 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 My father, Marcus, would step in blustering about bank errors and incompetence, trying to shield his embarrassment from the wealthy white-in-laws he was so desperate to please. But there is no arguing with a frozen asset. Back in the ballroom, my phone began its dance across the table, vibrating against the white tablecloth. It started as a low hum and quickly escalated into a frantic rhythm. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. For 10 years, I had managed the family fund, a pool of money I contributed to substantially, which my parents used to maintain their lifestyle and support Bianca's delusions of grandeur. They treated it like a bottomless well, and me as the silent pump. Today I had turned off the tap. The notifications piled up. Mom calling, Dad calling, Bianca calling. Then came the texts. Fix this now, Nia. The card is not working. Transfer the money immediately. We look like fools. Chase is watching. Pick up the phone, you ungrateful girl. I watched the screen light up repeatedly, illuminating the dark room like a strobe light of desperation. 75 missed calls. 75 times they reached out not to congratulate me, not to apologize for missing my wedding, but to demand I save them from the consequences of their own greed. I picked up the phone. Dante watched me, his expression guarded, ready to step in if I wavered. I did not waver. I swiped the power off button, silencing the noise. A profound quiet settled over the table. I looked at my new husband, and for the first time that day, a genuine smile touched my lips. It was the smile of a woman who had finally put down a heavy load she had been carrying since childhood. I opened my email app and drafted a single message addressed to Marcus and Vivian. Subject line: Notice of termination. The body of the email was simple. The family fund is closed. The house is no longer yours. The dress belongs to me. Our contract as family has been terminated effective immediately. I hit send. We did not go to a honeymoon suite or jet off to a tropical island. Instead, Dante drove us back to my townhouse in Buckhead, the silence in the car heavy with the weight of what I had just done. There was no carrying the bride over the threshold. We walked in like two detectives entering a crime scene. I went straight to my home office, still wearing my wedding dress. I sat down at my triple monitor setup and logged into the home security system. I needed concrete proof before I made my next move. Being a forensic accountant meant I did not deal in feelings, I dealt in evidence, and I knew exactly where to look. I pulled up the cloud storage from 2 weeks prior. I scrolled through the timeline until I found the date, October 14th. The timestamp read 10:42 in the morning. On the screen, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. My mother, Vivian, stepped out looking over her shoulder as if checking for witnesses. She walked to the large planter by the front door and retrieved the spare key I kept there for emergencies. I watched in high definition as she let herself into my sanctuary. The interior camera in the hallway captured the rest. She marched up the stairs with a purpose I rarely saw unless she was shopping. 10 minutes later, she descended. In her right hand, she carried a garment bag with the unmistakable vintage Christian Dior logo. In her left, she clutched a velvet box. My breath hitched. That box contained my grandmother's pearl necklace, a set valued at over $150,000. It was not just jewelry, it was the only thing I had left of the woman who actually raised me. I saved the clip and emailed it to my personal attorney and the district attorney's office. The sound of aggressive pounding on my front door shattered the quiet. I checked the live feed. My parents and Bianca were standing on my porch. They still had their keys, and before I could even stand up, they had barged into the foyer. Dante moved to intercept them, but I put a hand on his arm. This was my fight. They looked like a wreck. My mother's makeup was smeared, and her hair was windblown from the boat ride. Bianca was still wearing my dress, but the hem was now stained with mud and red wine. My father Marcus looked ready to explode, his face a dangerous shade of purple. They did not ask why I was not at my reception. They did not ask if I was okay. They launched straight into the attack. "How dare you!" my mother screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the hardwood floors. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" The waiter cut the card in front of Mrs. Sterling. We had to ask Chase to cover the deposit. We looked like paupers. My father paced the living room, kicking at the rug. "You ungrateful child. We raise you, we give you everything, and this is how you repay us. By humiliating us in front of the most important family in Atlanta. You need to fix this immediately. Transfer $50,000 to the main account right now. The check we wrote is going to bounce on Monday, and if it does, I will disown you." Bianca was crying, but they were tears of rage, not sorrow. She pointed a manicured finger at me. "You are just jealous, Nia. You have always been jealous because I am marrying real money and you settled for him." She gestured dismissively at Dante. You tried to ruin my engagement because you know you will never be as important as me. Give Mom the money so we can save face. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at them. I felt absolutely nothing. The fear and the desire to please them had evaporated, leaving only cold resolve. I held up my phone displaying the freeze frame of my mother walking out of my house with the stolen goods. I do not care about your humiliation, I said, my voice steady. I care about my property. You broke into my home. You stole a dress that belongs to me and jewelry that was left to me in a legal will. My mother laughed, a harsh sound that grated on my nerves. Don't be ridiculous, Nia. It is family property. I decided Bianca needed it more because she actually has a future in this society. You are not going to do anything. You never do. You are too weak. Bianca smirked, wiping her eyes. What are you going to do, call the cops on your own mother? You don't have the guts. I looked at them one last time, memorizing their arrogance. Return the dress and the necklace immediately, I said. Or I report this as grand larceny and burglary. I have the footage, I have the receipts. You have 24 hours. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. They truly believed I was bluffing. They thought the bond of blood was a shield that would protect them from any consequence. My father spit on my floor as he turned to leave. We will expect that transfer by morning or you will regret it. They walked out, slamming the door behind them, leaving silence and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with sweat. They walked away confident in their power over me. They had no idea that I had already filled out the police report. I locked the deadbolt. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency line. I wasn't bluffing. I did not sleep that night, not because I was heartbroken, but because I had work to do. While Dante slept, I retreated to my office and booted up my secure server. It was time to perform an autopsy on my parents' financial life. For years, I had kept a loose eye on their accounts, mostly to ensure they did not starve, but I had never looked too deep. I had been afraid of what I might find. Now fear was replaced by a clinical need for destruction. I started with public records, property liens, and credit reports. Being a forensic accountant meant I knew exactly how to follow the digital breadcrumbs people thought they had swept away. The first red flag popped up almost immediately on a property title search. The house my parents lived in, a sprawling colonial in a historic district, was the crown jewel of our family image. They paraded it around like proof of their success, but the truth was much simpler. My grandmother had bought that house 50 years ago. When she passed, she left the deed entirely to me. In her will, she had included a clause allowing my parents to live there rent-free for the rest of their lives, provided they paid the utilities and taxes. It was a kindness she had extended to her son, despite his incompetence. They did not own the bricks, they did not own the land, they were essentially glorified squatters with a very generous landlord. I pulled up the county clerk's recent filings. My heart stopped for a second, then resumed its beat with a heavy thud. 3 months ago, a second mortgage had been taken out on the property. The amount was staggering $300,000. I stared at the number on the screen. That was the exact budget Bianca had bragged about for her engagement party and the down payment for her wedding venue. They had liquidated the equity in my inheritance to fund a party designed to impress Chase's old money family. They were burning my assets to keep themselves warm in the glow of high society. But how? How does one mortgage a house they do not own? I dug deeper, accessing the loan documents through the bank's digital portal. The paperwork required the signature of the property owner. I scrolled to the bottom of the PDF. There it was. My name, Nia Brooks, signed in a looping flourish that looked nothing like my actual jagged script. It was a forgery, and a bad one at that. It looked like someone had practiced it a few times on a napkin before committing it to a federal document. My mother's handwriting. I recognized the way the N curled at the top. They had forged my signature to secure a loan against my property. This was not just a family betrayal. This was federal mortgage fraud. It was bank fraud. It was identity theft. They had crossed the line from bad parenting into felony criminal activity. I printed the documents, the pages warm against my cold hands. I lined them up on my desk next to the footage of the burglary. I had them. I had them completely. They were living in my house, spending my money and committing crimes in my name. I picked up my phone and called the bank's fraud department. It was 3 in the morning, but their automated system allowed me to flag the account for immediate review. Then I drafted a new email to my lawyer. Subject line: mortgage fraud and eviction proceedings. I attached the forged documents and the original deed. I did not feel a shred of guilt. They had mortgaged their future for a night of champagne and oysters. Now the bill was coming due, and I was the one collecting. I stared at the fraud report on my desk while the morning sun barely touched the skyline of Atlanta. The police report was filled out and ready to file, but I hesitated. Sending Marcus and Vivian to jail for forgery was justice, but it was not enough. It was too quick, too sterile. Prison would give them a sob story to tell their friends about how their ungrateful daughter misunderstood a family arrangement. No, I needed something more absolute. I needed to hold the leash. I closed the police file and opened my banking portal. I had spent a decade building my wealth not by spending it on yachts and parties, but by investing in high-yield portfolios and real estate. I had liquidity, serious liquidity. And right now, my parents were drowning in a sea of bad decisions. They had taken out a predatory loan against a house they did not own, using a forged signature. That meant the bank holding the note was sitting on a toxic asset. Banks hate toxic assets. They want them off their books, especially before the end of a fiscal quarter. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer again. I need a rush on a new business entity, I told him. A Delaware LLC. Total anonymity. No paper trail leading back to Nia Brooks. Call it Nemesis Holdings. Within 48 hours, the paperwork was filed. Nemesis Holdings was a legitimate investment firm on paper with a registered agent and a hefty bank account funded entirely by me. My next call was to the distressed assets manager at the regional bank that held the fraudulent mortgage. I introduced myself not as the victim of the fraud, but as the representative of a private equity firm looking to acquire high-risk debt. The meeting took place in a glass-walled office in downtown Atlanta. I wore a tailored black suit and dark sunglasses that I did not remove. I sat across from a nervous bank executive who was all too eager to discuss the loan associated with the property on Maple Street. He told me the borrowers were already 30 days late on their first payment. He called it a non-performing loan. I called it an opportunity. I offered to buy the mortgage note for 60 cents on the dollar. It was a low-ball offer, but I knew the bank was terrified. If I exposed the forgery, the loan would become void and they would be left with a legal nightmare and zero collateral. By selling the debt to me, they washed their hands of the problem and got immediate cash. The executive barely hesitated. He slid the assignment of mortgage across the mahogany table. I signed the documents with a steady hand. With that signature, the ownership of the debt transferred from the bank to Nemesis Holdings. The bank got their money and walked away. And I got the deed of trust. I walked out of the bank with a single folder tucked under my arm. The weight of it was intoxicating. I sat in my car and opened the file. There it was. The promissory note signed with my forged name. The mortgage deed. I ran my fingers over the paper. My parents thought they had pulled off a clever trick to fund Bianca's engagement. They thought they had secured free money. They had no idea that they had just sold their souls to me. I drove past the house on my way home. I saw Bianca's car in the driveway. I saw my mother pruning the roses in the front yard, roses that grew in soil I owned. They were living inside the belly of the beast, and they didn't even know they had been swallowed. When I got home, Dante was waiting in the kitchen. He saw the folder and the look on my face. "You bought it, didn't you?" he asked, pouring me a glass of wine. "I bought it all," I said, placing the folder on the counter. "I own the debt. I own the interest. I own the late fees. Technically, I am their landlord, their bank, and their executioner. Dante looked at the papers and then at me with a mixture of admiration and fear. So what happens when they miss the next payment? I took a sip of wine, the liquid cool and sharp. When they miss the next payment, Nemesis Holdings will send a notice of default. And if they don't pay in full, which we know they can't, Nemesis Holdings will exercise its right to foreclose. I can evict them, Dante. I can put a padlock on the door and toss their furniture onto the curb, and it will be completely legal. I looked out the window at the city lights. They wanted to play games with property and ownership. They wanted to pretend they were the royalty of Atlanta. Now they were just tenants in a house of cards, and I was the wind. I wasn't going to blow it down yet. I was going to let them get comfortable. I was going to let them spend every last dime on this wedding thinking they were safe. And then when they had nothing left, I was going to call in the debt. The invitation was not a request. It was a summons. My mother called me 3 times in a span of 10 minutes, her voice tight with the frantic energy of a woman trying to hold a crumbling facade together with hairspray and lies. "The Sterlings want a family dinner," she hissed into the phone. "Chase's parents. They want to meet the whole clan. You have to come, Nia. You have to look presentable. And for the love of God, do not talk about your little detective investigations. We told them you work in administration. Just smile, nod, and try not to embarrass your sister." I agreed only because I wanted a front row seat to the performance. The dinner was held at Le Jardin, the kind of French restaurant where the lighting is dim enough to hide cosmetic surgery scars, and the menus do not list prices. I arrived exactly on time wearing a simple black dress that cost more than my mother's entire wardrobe, though she would never recognize the label. I sat next to Dante, who looked ready to flip the table at the first insult. I squeezed his hand under the tablecloth, a silent command to wait. The Sterlings were old money. You could tell by the way Mrs. Sterling wore her pearls not as jewelry, but as armor. She was a woman made of steel and judgment, her eyes scanning the room with a critical precision I actually admired. Chase looked nervous, his collar too tight. Bianca sat next to him, performing the role of the blushing debutante to perfection, laughing a little too loudly at Mr. Sterling's dry jokes. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, were sweating. They were trying too hard, laughing too eagerly, pouring wine too frequently. They looked like what they were, desperate people trying to sell a lemon. The conversation meandered through safe topics like the weather and summer homes, until Mrs. Sterling turned her gaze directly on me. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent. "And what do you do, Nia?" she asked, her tone polite but probing. "Bianca tells us you are quite the worker." I opened my mouth to answer, to tell her that I ran a successful forensic accounting firm that specialized in high-stakes fraud investigations. But before I could get a word out, my mother cut in, her laugh shrill and nervous. "Oh, Nia is such a help around the office," Vivian said, waving her hand dismissively. "She is an administrative assistant at a local firm. Filing, scheduling, answering phones, that sort of thing. She is very organized, but you know she prefers a quiet life. She is not ambitious like Bianca." Bianca chimed in, sipping her champagne. "Yes, poor Nia. It is not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills." "Barely. We try to help her out when we can." She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Right, Nia?" The table went deadly quiet. I saw Dante's jaw clench so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He started to speak, to defend me, to burn them all down right there. I pressed my heel gently onto his foot. "Not yet. Let them dig. Let them pile the dirt so high they can never climb out." I took a sip of water, my face a mask of polite submission. "That is right," I said, my voice soft and agreeable. "I just handle the paperwork. I am very good with paperwork, especially the numbers." Mrs. Sterling looked at me for a long moment, and I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She sensed the lie, but she did not know the shape of it yet. The main course arrived and the conversation drifted back to the wedding. My mother launched into a monologue about the floral arrangements, trying to distract from the tension. I waited for the plates to be cleared. I waited until the lull before dessert. Then I made my move. I stood up, picking up my clutch. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to visit the ladies' room. Dante, darling, would you order me an espresso?" I walked away from the table, my movements smooth and unhurried. I left my purse, but I took my clutch. And on the table right next to my water glass, I left a sleek leather folder. It looked like a work portfolio, something an administrative assistant might carry. I had placed it carefully so that the cover was slightly askew. I did not look back as I walked to the restroom. I knew exactly what would happen. Human nature is predictable, especially when money is involved. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who protected her family's assets. A stray folder sitting on the table belonging to the poor sister would be irresistible. Inside the restroom, I reapplied my lipstick in the mirror, counting the seconds. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Enough time for a wandering eye to catch a bold red number. The folder did not contain my resume. It contained a comprehensive credit report, but not mine. It was Bianca's. It detailed 6 maxed-out credit cards, a credit score that had tanked into the low 400s, and a pending lawsuit from a previous landlord for 12 months of unpaid rent. It was a financial autopsy of a woman who was drowning in debt while pretending to float. I waited another minute just to be sure. When I walked back into the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was colder. Mrs. Sterling was sitting very straight, her hands folded in her lap. The leather folder had been moved just an inch, but it was closed now. She was not looking at Bianca anymore. She was looking at me. And in her eyes I saw it. The recognition. The understanding. She knew. She had seen the truth in black and white. She knew her son was about to marry a financial liability. She knew my parents were liars. And she knew I was not just a secretary. Bianca was babbling about honeymoon destinations in the Maldives, oblivious to the iceberg she had just struck. My mother was nodding enthusiastically, desperate to keep the energy high. But Mrs. Sterling was silent. She looked at her son Chase with a gaze that said, "We need to talk immediately." I sat down and smiled at the woman who might have been my mother-in-law in another life. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Sterling?" I asked innocently. She looked at the folder, then back at me. Her lips curved in a microscopic smile of acknowledgement. A warrior recognizing another warrior. "Everything is quite illuminating, Nia," she said. "Quite illuminating indeed." I finished my espresso. The trap was sprung. The predator had scented blood. The dinner with the Sterlings was a victory, but it was only a skirmish. The war was still being fought in the trenches of digital paper trails. I returned to my home office that night, fueled by espresso and a cold, burning rage. I knew Bianca was irresponsible with money, but the credit report I had left for Mrs. Sterling was just the surface. It showed her debts. It did not explain how she had managed to stay afloat this long without a job. I logged into my professional forensic software, the kind used by federal agencies to track money laundering. I ran a comprehensive sweep of my own identifiers. Usually I monitored my accounts monthly, but with the wedding planning consuming my life, I had let it slide for the last 6 months. That was a mistake I would never make again. The system flagged 3 accounts immediately. They were high-limit credit cards issued by banks I did not bank with. They were opened 18 months ago, right around the time Bianca had moved into her penthouse. I clicked on the details. The name on the account was Nia Brooks. The social security number was mine. But the billing address was a P.O. box in downtown Atlanta that I had never rented. I pulled the transaction history. It was a roadmap of my sister's vanity. There were charges for the lease on her Mercedes, charges for first-class flights to Miami, charges for the lip fillers and the Botox she claimed were natural, and then the recent ones. The deposit for the wedding florist, the down payment for the DJ. She had spent $50,000 in my name. She had stolen my identity to fund the very lifestyle she used to belittle me. She had built her golden pedestal on the back of my credit score. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. This was not just family dysfunction. This was a felony. Identity theft is a federal crime punishable by up to 15 years in prison. My sister had looked me in the eye for a year, criticized my budget wedding, and called me cheap, while she was actively stealing from me to pay for her own extravagance. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the national credit bureaus. I navigated the automated menus with the muscle memory of a professional. When I finally reached a fraud specialist, I was calm, precise, and deadly. "I am reporting unauthorized activity," I told the agent. "I have 3 accounts that were opened fraudulently using my social security number. I want to flag them as identity theft and freeze my credit immediately." I spent the next 3 hours filling out affidavits and police reports online. I disputed every single charge. I marked every transaction as fraudulent. I did not call Bianca. I did not send a warning text to my mother. I wanted them to find out the hard way. I wanted them to find out when the plastic in their wallets turned into useless scraps of plastic. The process was instantaneous in the digital age. Algorithms flagged the accounts. Security protocols kicked in. One by one, the cards were locked. 2 days later, I got the confirmation I was waiting for, not from a bank, but from a panicked text in the family group chat. Bianca sent a message in all caps. "Has anyone else's card stopped working? I'm at the bridal salon and the machine keeps rejecting my payment for the bridesmaids' dresses. It says refer to issuer, mom help." I read the message and took a sip of my morning tea. I watched the 3 dots of my mother typing and then deleting and then typing again. She couldn't help. Her assets were tied up in the mortgage I now owned. They were trapped in a financial cage of their own making, and I had just locked the door. I put my phone down and went to work. The dress fitting would have to wait. I was scrolling through my timeline in the quiet hours of the morning when the image hit me like a slap to the face. Bianca had posted a carousel of photos from a pre-wedding cocktail party. The caption read, "Customizing vintage for the modern bride. Out with the old, in with the fabulous." There she was posing with a champagne flute surrounded by her sycophantic friends. But it wasn't her smile that froze my blood. It was the dress. My grandmother's vintage Christian Dior gown. The cream silk taffeta masterpiece that had been preserved for 60 years. The dress she wore when she married my grandfather, the dress she had whispered was for me on her deathbed. It was unrecognizable. Bianca had taken scissors to history. The floor-length skirt was gone, hacked off above the knee to create a jagged, uneven hemline that was meant to look edgy but just looked cheap. The delicate lace sleeves had been ripped off, leaving raw edges. She had turned a piece of art into a fast-fashion disaster for a single night of vanity. A sound escaped my throat, a ragged gasp that sounded like something dying. I dropped my phone on the desk, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't pick it up. I felt physically ill. That dress wasn't just fabric. It was a memory. It was the smell of my grandmother's lavender perfume. It was the story of a woman who had built a life from nothing, and my sister had destroyed it because she wanted to show off her legs. I closed my eyes and breathed. In, out. In, out. The pain was sharp, a physical ache in my chest, but then, as it always did, the cold set in. The grief crystallized into ice. If they wanted to treat my inheritance like trash, I would treat them like a liability. I opened my laptop. I didn't need to look up the value of the dress. I had had it appraised for insurance purposes 3 years ago, $25,000, a conservative estimate for a vintage couture piece in pristine condition. Now it was worth 0. It was a rag. I drafted a formal demand letter. I attached the appraisal document, the original will stating the dress was mine, and the screenshots of Bianca's Instagram post showing the destruction of property. I calculated the interest. I added a clause for emotional distress, though I knew that wouldn't hold up in court. It was about sending a message. I printed the document on heavy bond paper. I didn't mail it. I drove to my parents' house. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted them to look me in the eye when they tried to justify this. When I arrived, they were in the living room, hungover and sluggish from the party. Bianca was there scrolling on her phone, likely deleting negative comments about her butchered dress. I walked in without knocking. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the invoice on the coffee table in front of my father. "What is this?" Marcus asked, picking up the paper with a frown. He read it, his eyes widening. $25,000 for a used dress. It was a vintage Dior, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. It was an heirloom. It was mine. Bianca stole it and she destroyed it. This is the bill for damages. Bianca looked up, laughing. Oh, please, Nia. It was an old rag. It smelled like mothballs. I did you a favor. I made it wearable. You should be thanking me for updating your wardrobe. My mother chimed in, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. Really, Nia, must you put a price tag on everything? It's just clothes. Bianca looked beautiful in it. That's what matters. Your grandmother would have wanted her to enjoy it. My grandmother left it to me, I said. Not her. Me. You stole it. You destroyed it. You owe me $25,000. My father stood up, his face reddening. He ripped the invoice in half, then in quarters. He threw the pieces in my face. We owe you nothing, he spat. You are petty and greedy. Get out of my house before I call the police for harassment. I watched the pieces of paper flutter to the floor. I looked at the shreds of my claim lying there like snow. They were laughing. My mother was shaking her head, smiling at my audacity. Bianca was rolling her eyes. They thought this was the end of it. They thought tearing up a piece of paper made the debt disappear. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I knelt down and picked up one piece of the torn invoice. Just one. I put it in my pocket. Okay, I said, you've made your position clear. I turned and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently. They thought they had won. They didn't know that by tearing up that invoice, they had just given me the final piece of evidence I needed to prove malicious intent. They hadn't destroyed the debt. They had just guaranteed that when I collected, I would take everything. The summons came on a Tuesday evening, just 48 hours after my father had thrown the torn invoice for the dress in my face. My mother called me, her voice dripping with a frantic sweetness that usually preceded a request for money. She said it was a family emergency. She said we needed to present a united front for the wedding. She said, please come over, Nia, we need your business expertise. I knew it was a trap, but traps are only dangerous if you do not see the spring mechanism. I drove to the house I technically owned and parked behind my father's leased BMW, which I knew was 2 payments behind. When I walked into the living room, the atmosphere was thick with desperate calculation. Marcus and Vivian were sitting on the sofa, a stack of legal documents on the coffee table between them. Bianca was nowhere to be seen, which meant this was the dirty work. My mother poured me a cup of tea, her hands shaking slightly. We have a small problem, she began, avoiding my eyes. We may have made a promise to the Sterlings that we are having a little trouble keeping. I took the tea but did not drink it. What kind of promise? I asked, my voice neutral. My father cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. It is customary in families of Chase's stature to provide a substantial wedding gift, a dowry of sorts. We told Mrs. Sterling that we were gifting Bianca a property, a starter home, to show that we are contributors to this union, not just beneficiaries. I waited. I knew exactly where this was going. We told them we were giving her a condo, my mother rushed on. A nice one. In Midtown. I stared at her. I owned a condo in Midtown. It was a 2-bedroom investment property I had bought in foreclosure 3 years ago, renovated with my own hands, and currently rented out for passive income. It was my asset, not theirs. You want my apartment? I said. It was not a question. It is not for us, my father said quickly, his tone shifting to that familiar manipulative baritone. It is for your sister. Think about it, Nia. Chase is going to be incredibly wealthy. Once they are married, Bianca will have access to millions. If we give her this condo now, it secures her position. And later, when they are established, she will pay you back. She will look after you. Sisters have to help sisters. I looked at the documents on the table. They were transfer of deed forms. They had already filled them out. All they needed was my signature to sign over a $300,000 asset for $0. They wanted me to give away my hard-earned investment so they could lie to a billionaire family about their net worth. This is my retirement fund, I said slowly. This is my property. You want me to just hand it over so you can play pretend with the Sterlings. My mother leaned forward, reaching for my hand. I pulled it away. Don't be so transactional, Nia. She snapped, her sweetness evaporating. This is an investment in the family. Bianca is the one marrying into power. You are the one with the steady, boring job. You can afford to take a hit. She needs this to maintain her dignity with those people. Do you want her to look like a beggar? So, I am the sacrifice, I said. Again. My father slammed his hand on the table. You are being selfish. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. This condo is the least you can do. If Bianca does not have a property to bring to the marriage, Mrs. Sterling will think we are frauds. She might call off the wedding. Do you want to be responsible for destroying your sister's happiness? I looked at them, really looked at them. They were not parents. They were parasites looking for a new host. They were willing to strip me bare to clothe Bianca in a lie. I reached into my pocket and silently tapped the record button on my phone. I needed them to say it. I needed the extortion on tape. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice trembling with feigned hesitation. You told the Sterlings you owned my condo, and now you want me to sign a quitclaim deed transferring it to Bianca for free so you can hide the fact that you have no money. And if I do not do it, you will blame me for ruining the wedding. Yes, my mother hissed. Exactly. It is a loan, Nia. A loan of assets. Just sign the papers. I picked up the pen. I hovered it over the signature line. I watched them hold their breath, their greed naked and ugly on their faces. I cannot sign this today, I said, lowering the pen. I need to check the tax implications. If I gift a property of this value, the IRS will audit me. I need 48 hours to structure it so I do not go to jail. My father looked suspicious, but my mother's eyes lit up at the mention of the IRS. She was terrified of audits. That makes sense, she said. You handle the numbers. Just fix it, Nia. Make it happen by Friday. I stood up, taking the unsigned documents with me. I will see what I can do, I said. I walked out of the house with the evidence of their attempted extortion in my pocket and their confession recorded on my phone. They thought I was going home to prepare a gift. I was going home to prepare a lawsuit. They wanted a property transfer. I was going to give them an eviction notice. While I was navigating the treachery of property fraud, my husband Dante was fighting his own battle on a different front. Dante owned one of the most successful cybersecurity firms in the Southeast, a company built on trust, discretion, and bulletproof encryption. My father Marcus had always dismissed Dante's work as computer games, but desperation has a way of changing a man's perspective. Suddenly he saw Dante not as a son-in-law, but as a data mine. Dante came home late one evening, his face grim. He tossed his keys on the counter and poured himself a whiskey neat. Your father approached one of my competitors today, he said without preamble. He offered to sell them proprietary client lists and beta codes for our new security patch. I stopped chopping vegetables. He did what? He tried to commit corporate espionage, Nia. He thinks because I let him into the office once for a family lunch that he saw enough to sell. He does not realize that everything he saw was public-facing marketing material. But he is desperate enough to try and package it as trade secrets. I felt a wave of nausea. My father was not just a bad parent, he was a liability. He was willing to destroy my husband's livelihood for a quick payout. How much did he ask for? 50,000, Dante said, taking a long sip. The exact amount they need to cover the catering deposit for the wedding. I looked at Dante. He was not angry. He was calculating. He was a man who hunted hackers for a living. He knew how to set a honeypot. Let him do it, I said. Let him think he has the keys to the kingdom. Dante smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that matched my own. I already did. I created a dummy file on a secure drive. I labeled it Project Omega. Inside is a lot of impressive-looking code that actually does absolutely nothing except ping back its location to my server once it is opened. I left the drive on the desk in the guest room the last time he was here. I checked the logs. He copied it. 2 days later, the trap snapped shut. My father met with a shady broker known for dealing in stolen tech IP. He handed over the flash drive demanding cash up front. The broker, eager for a scoop on Dante's company, paid him $20,000, a fraction of the asking price, but enough to keep the wedding vendors from walking out. But the victory was short-lived. The broker sold the data to a rival firm who immediately tried to implement the code. When they realized they had purchased digital gibberish, they were furious. They demanded their money back, plus damages for wasted resources. When my father couldn't pay because he had already spent the cash on a deposit for a custom ice sculpture, the rival firm threatened legal action for fraud. Suddenly, my parents were fighting a war on two fronts. They had the bank breathing down their necks about the mortgage, and now they had a tech company threatening a lawsuit. The walls were closing in. I watched it all unfold from a distance like a general observing a battlefield. The pressure was mounting. Every phone call my mother made was a frantic plea for extensions. Every time my father left the house, he looked over his shoulder, terrified of process servers. They were running out of time. They were running out of lies. And their only lifeline was the wedding. They needed Bianca to marry Chase. They needed access to the Sterling fortune to pay off the debts they had accrued trying to impress the Sterlings. It was a snake eating its own tail. Dante walked into my office and kissed the top of my head. "The rival firm just sent a cease and desist to your father," he whispered. "They are demanding $50,000 in settlement or they go to the police." I leaned back in my chair. "He doesn't have it." "No, he doesn't." Dante agreed. "Which means they are going to get even more desperate." I nodded. Desperate people make mistakes, and I was counting on them to make one final, fatal error. The wedding was in 3 weeks. It was going to be a race to the bottom, and I intended to be there when they hit the ground. The bridal shower was held at the Ritz-Carlton naturally. Bianca would settle for nothing less than tea sandwiches that cost more than a car payment. I arrived late wearing my favorite thrift store find, a vintage dress that looked expensive but cost me $20. I wasn't invited, of course, but when you own the debt of the hosts, you tend to get a seat at the table, whether they like it or not. The room was filled with women who looked like they were auditioning for a reality show about rich housewives. Bianca sat at the head of the table, wearing a white lace dress that probably cost $3,000 paid for with one of the credit cards I had frozen. She was holding court, laughing loudly, her hand resting possessively on a stack of gifts. When I walked in, the room went quiet. Bianca's smile faltered, then sharpened into a sneer. "Well, look who it is," she drawled, her voice carrying across the room. "The poor relation." "Did you come for the free food, Nia? I know groceries are expensive on a secretary's salary." Her friends giggled, covering their mouths with manicured hands. My mother, sitting next to Bianca, looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. She knew exactly why I was there. She knew I was the storm cloud on their sunny day. I smiled, pulling up a chair that wasn't set for me. "I just wanted to wish my baby sister well," I said, my voice sweet as poisoned honey. "It is not every day you get married into a family like the Sterlings. You must be so relieved." Bianca narrowed her eyes. "Relieved about what?" "That you finally found someone to pay your bills," I said, taking a macaron from the tiered tray. "It must be exhausting spending money you don't have." Bianca slammed her hand on the table. "You are just jealous. You are jealous because I am beautiful and successful, and marrying a man who can buy and sell your pathetic little life. You should be grateful we even let you in the door. Now sit down and shut up or leave." I sat. I ate the macaron. I watched. The bill came an hour later. It was presented on a silver tray, discreet and elegant. The total was $4,000. Bianca didn't even look at it. She pulled out her sleek black credit card, the one with my social security number attached to it, and handed it to the waiter with a dismissive wave. "Put it on this," she said, "and add 20%. The waiter walked away. 5 minutes later, he returned. He leaned down, whispering something to Bianca. She frowned. "Try it again," she said loudly. "It's a black card. It has no limit." He walked away. He came back. This time he wasn't whispering. "I am sorry, miss." He said, his voice polite but firm. "The card has been declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Bianca's face went red. She pulled out another card. "Try this one." Declined. She pulled out a third. Declined. The silence in the room was suffocating. Her friends were exchanging glances. My mother was pale. Bianca looked at me, her eyes wide with panic. She knew. She knew exactly what was happening. "You did this," she hissed. I took a sip of tea. I didn't do anything, I said calmly. I just secured my identity. It is amazing what happens when you stop letting people steal from you. Bianca stood up, knocking her chair over. "You have to pay for this," she screamed, pointing at the bill. "You are my sister. You have to help me." I looked at her. I looked at the waiter who was waiting expectantly. I looked at the room full of women who had spent the last hour laughing at my expense. "I can't," I said, my voice ringing clear and loud. "I am just a secretary, remember? I barely make ends meet. $4,000 is my salary for 2 months. I couldn't possibly afford a party like this." Bianca looked like she was going to explode. "You are lying. You have money. You have a company. Pay the bill, Nia." I stood up, smoothing my skirt. "I thought I was a poor relation," I said. "I thought I was a failure." "You can't have it both ways, Bianca. Either I am successful and you are a liar, or I am broke and you are on your own. Which is it?" She couldn't answer. To admit I had money was to admit she had been lying to everyone for years. To admit I was broke was to admit she was stuck with the bill. She was trapped in her own web. I walked to the door. "Good luck with the dishes," I said. As I left, I heard the manager's voice, stern and unyielding. "If you cannot pay, miss, we will have to call the police. Or perhaps you can call your fiancé." I paused in the hallway, listening. I heard Bianca sobbing as she dialed Chase's number. I heard her trying to explain why her cards weren't working, why she needed him to come down and bail her out of a tea party. I heard the humiliation in her voice. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was a Monday morning when the war came to my doorstep. My office is a fortress of glass and steel in the financial district of downtown Atlanta, a place my parents had never visited because they believed the lie that I was merely a secretary in a cubicle. When they stormed into the lobby screaming my name, they were in for a shock. They were looking for a mouse, and they walked into a lion's den. My executive assistant buzzed me, her voice cool and professional. "Ms. Brooks, there are 2 individuals here causing a disturbance. They claim to be your parents. I told her to let them in. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to see the corner office, the panoramic view of the city, the plaque on the door that read senior partner. I wanted them to understand exactly who they had been stealing from." Marcus and Vivian burst through the heavy oak doors looking like cornered animals. My father was sweating through his linen suit, his face a mask of panic. My mother's eyes were wild, her hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper. They didn't even pause to register the luxury of the room or the fact that I was sitting behind a desk that cost more than their car. They slammed a foreclosure notice onto my blotter. "What is this?" my father roared, his voice shaking the glass walls. "Nemesis Holdings. Who are they? They are threatening to take the house next week. Fix this, Nia. Use your company money. We know you have it now. We saw your car in the parking lot." I didn't stand up. I simply swiveled my chair, slowly locking eyes with my father. "I see you found the notice," I said, my voice calm and level. "It turns out, when you don't pay your mortgage for 3 months, the bank gets upset. Or in this case, the new note holder." My mother lunged forward, slamming her hands on the mahogany desk. "Stop playing games, Nia. Chase is coming over for dinner tonight to finalize the seating chart for the reception. If we lose the house before the wedding, he will know everything. He will know we are frauds. You have to pay this off. You owe us. We gave you life. We raised you. You gave me nothing but debt and trauma." I replied, my voice devoid of warmth. "I am done fixing your messes. I am done being the bank. But I will offer you one last lifeline. because I am feeling generous today. I stood up then, smoothing my blazer and walking around the desk to lean against the front of it, crossing my arms. You have two choices. Option A is you sit Chase down tonight and tell him the truth. Tell him you are bankrupt. Tell him you forged my signature on the mortgage documents. Tell him Bianca is a thief who stole my identity. And then you return my dress and my pearls immediately. My parents stared at me in horror. My mother looked as if I had suggested she cut off her own hand. We can't do that, she hissed. It would ruin Bianca. It would ruin us. Then you have option B. I continued, leaning in closer. I proceed. I will let the foreclosure happen. I will press charges for the identity theft. And I will personally hand the forensic audit of your finances to Mrs. Sterling. I will destroy you completely. I will strip you of every lie you have wrapped yourselves in until the whole city sees you for what you are. The silence stretched thin and brittle in the room. I could hear the hum of the server drives in the corner. Then my mother moved. It was fast, a flash of movement fueled by decades of entitlement and rage. Her hand connected with my cheek, a sharp, stinging slap that echoed in the quiet office. My head snapped to the side. You ungrateful little brat, she spat, her face contorted with ugly rage. You are a monster. You think you can threaten us. We are your parents. You will never win against us. We own you. You are nothing without us. You are just a jealous, bitter little girl. I didn't touch my cheek, though it burned. I didn't flinch. I slowly turned my head back to face them. I looked at my mother's trembling hand. I looked at my father's sneer. And I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Security, I said calmly. Escort them out. And if they return, call the police. Two large uniformed guards appeared in the doorway within seconds. They took my parents by the arms. My father tried to bluster, tried to pull rank, but he had no rank here. This was my kingdom. Get your hands off me, he shouted as they dragged him backward. Nia, tell them to stop. Nia, do not do this. I watched them go, kicking and screaming like toddlers being removed from a playground. They thought the slap was a display of power. They didn't realize it was the final nail in their coffin. They had just assaulted me on camera in a building full of witnesses. I touched my stinging cheek and turned back to my computer. They had chosen option B. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer. Proceed with the eviction, I said, and send the file to the Sterlings. The air in Atlanta was thick with humidity and the smell of impending disaster on the eve of my sister's wedding. While Bianca was busy steaming the wrinkles out of a backup dress, because I had reclaimed the Dior, my parents were busy digging their own graves. They had run out of banks to defraud and family members to swindle, so they turned to the only lender left who didn't check credit scores. They went to a hard money lender in the back of a pawn shop on the south side. I knew this because I was tracking their location data through the family plan they had forgotten I paid for. They walked out with a duffel bag containing $200,000 in cash. It was a loan with an interest rate that would make a credit card company blush, secured by nothing but their kneecaps and a delusion. They were betting the farm, literally and figuratively, on the idea that once Bianca said "I do," Chase would open his checkbook and wipe away their sins. They threw the money at the florists, the caterers, and the venue, paying premium rush fees to ensure the illusion of wealth held for just 24 more hours. They were constructing a fairy tale on a foundation of quicksand. I sat in the conference room of my lawyer's office watching the city lights flicker below. On the table in front of me sat the completed lawsuit. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression. The foreclosure filings, the identity theft affidavits, the evidence of mortgage fraud. It was all there. A paper guillotine waiting to drop. But I wasn't going to drop it just yet. I needed the audience to be assembled. I needed the stage to be set. I took a single manila envelope and slid a curated selection of documents inside. It wasn't the whole file. It was just enough to raise a question. A copy of the forged mortgage application, a credit report showing Bianca's six-figure debt, and a single photograph of my parents entering the pawn shop earlier that day. I sealed it with a piece of tape. I called a courier service. I need this delivered to the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, I told the dispatcher. It is for Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling. It must be placed directly in her hands. An hour later, I received the confirmation of delivery. I imagined Mrs. Sterling sitting in her silk robe sipping herbal tea preparing for her son's nuptials. She would open the envelope. She would not gasp. She would not scream. She was a woman who had managed a dynasty for 40 years. She would simply put on her reading glasses. She would look at the forgery. She would look at the debt. She would look at the photo of her future in-laws engaging in a criminal transaction. And then she would do exactly what I expected her to do. She picked up the phone. She didn't call her son. She didn't call my parents. She dialed a number she kept for very specific problems. I need a full background check on Marcus and Vivian Brooks, she said, her voice cool and detached. And I need it by morning. The trap was not just set, it was baited. My parents were sleeping on satin sheets paid for with blood money thinking they had won. They didn't realize that the matriarch of the family they were trying to infiltrate was now sharpening her knife. The wedding was in 12 hours. It was going to be a spectacle. The venue was a sprawling estate outside the city limits, a place of manicured lawns and marble columns that screamed old Southern money. My parents had spared no expense using the cash they had borrowed from the loan shark at exorbitant interest rates. They had filled the sanctuary with thousands of white roses, creating a suffocatingly sweet atmosphere that masked the stench of desperation clinging to them. I arrived 10 minutes before the procession began. I did not wear pastel chiffon or a festive floral print. I wore black. A floor-length silk gown with long sleeves and a high neck, the kind of dress a grieving widow wears to the funeral of a head of state. I added a black veil to my fascinator just to make the message unmistakable. When the usher tried to guide me to the second row, I ignored him and took my seat in the front row directly across from where Mrs. Sterling sat. The murmur that rippled through the congregation was immediate and sharp. I saw my mother Vivian stiffen in the front pew, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her program. She turned to glare at me, her eyes promising retribution, but I simply smoothed my skirt and stared straight ahead. I was not a guest at a wedding. I was the angel of death attending an execution. The organ music swelled, signaling the start of the show. My father, Marcus, walked down the aisle puffing his chest out, trying to look like the patriarch of a dynasty rather than a man who was technically homeless. He was sweating profusely despite the climate control, a sheen of panic slicking his forehead. He smiled at the guests, but his eyes darted around nervously as if he expected the walls to cave in at any moment. He didn't know how right he was. Then came Bianca. The doors opened and she stepped into the light. Since I had reclaimed my grandmother's vintage Dior, she was wearing a modern designer gown likely purchased with one of the fraudulent credit cards before I froze them. It was gaudy, covered in crystals that caught the light in a desperate bid for attention. But I didn't look at the dress. My eyes locked onto her neck. There they were. My grandmother's South Sea pearls. The luminous strand of history that my mother had stolen from my safe. They glowed against Bianca's skin, a symbol of purity draped over a thief. Seeing them on her was a physical violation. It was the final confirmation that there was no line they wouldn't cross. No memory they wouldn't desecrate to feed their ego. My hands curled into fists in my lap, but I forced them to relax. I needed to be calm. I needed to be the ice to their fire. Chase stood at the altar looking every bit the golden boy, unaware that he was marrying into a crime family. He smiled as Bianca approached him, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother had a private investigator's report sitting in her purse. Bianca reached the altar and handed her bouquet to her maid of honor. She looked triumphant. She looked at me in the front row and smirked a small victorious tilt of her lips that said, "I won." She thought the ring on her finger was a finish line. She didn't realize it was a target. The music faded. The pastor cleared his throat and began the liturgy. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words washed over me, meaningless and hollow. I was not listening to the sermon. I was counting seconds. I glanced down at my watch, a Patek Philippe I had bought with my first big bonus. The second hand swept past the 9. It was 1:59 in the afternoon. The ceremony progressed. My parents held hands feigning marital bliss while calculating how quickly they could ask Chase for a loan after the reception. Mrs. Sterling watched them with the cold, detached gaze of a hawk circling a field mouse. She knew. I could tell by the set of her jaw that she knew everything I had sent her. She was just waiting for the right moment to strike. And then the pastor reached the critical juncture. The moment that is usually just a formality in modern weddings, but today felt like the click of a loaded gun. If anyone here present knows of any just cause why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Every eye in the church instinctively darted to me, the woman in black sitting in the front row. They expected a scene. They expected the jealous sister to stand up and scream. My mother turned her head slightly, her eyes wide with terror, silently begging me to stay seated. My father looked like he was about to have a heart stroke. Bianca's smile faltered, her eyes flicking nervously in my direction. I did not stand. I did not shout. I did not make a sound. I simply raised my left wrist and looked at my watch. The second hand ticked over the 12. 2 o'clock, 0 hour. The assets were seized, the warrants were active, the authorities had been notified. I lowered my wrist and looked up, meeting my mother's gaze. I didn't say a word, but the expression on my face told her everything. It is over. And then the heavy oak doors at the back of the church groaned open. It was not a late guest. The heavy rhythmic thud of boots on the stone floor echoed through the silent sanctuary. The sound of justice arriving right on schedule. The heavy double doors at the entrance of the sanctuary slammed against the walls with a violence that made the stained glass windows rattle. The sound cut through the organ music like a gunshot. Every head turned. It was not a late arrival or a lost guest. Standing in the frame of the afternoon sun were 4 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in cheap suits. Behind them stood a man holding a thick leather binder, whom I recognized immediately as the court-appointed enforcement officer. They did not wait for an invitation. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the stone floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The guests gasped and pulled back, shrinking away from the intrusion. My mother let out a strangled noise, a sound of pure animal panic, but she was frozen in place. My father looked as though he wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The altar was a dead end. The lead detective stepped up onto the dais, pushing past the bewildered pastor. He did not look at the bride. He did not look at the groom. He looked directly at my parents, Marcus and Vivian Brooks. He boomed his voice, projecting to the back of the church without a microphone. "You are under arrest." My father found his voice, then a high-pitched sputter of indignation. "This is a wedding," he shouted, his face turning a mottled red. "You cannot come in here like this. Do you know who I am? Get out immediately." The detective did not blink. He pulled a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt, the sound of the ratchet clicking loud in the silence. "We know exactly who you are, sir. You are Marcus Brooks, and you are being charged with 4 counts of bank fraud, 2 counts of aggravated forgery, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Before my father could protest again, the officer spun him around and slammed his chest against the altar railing. The click of the cuffs snapping onto his wrists sent a shockwave through the room. My mother screamed a piercing wail that shattered the last remnants of dignity she had clung to. 2 other officers moved on her. They were less rough but just as firm. "Vivian Brooks, you are also under arrest for conspiracy and aiding and abetting the fraudulent mortgage of a property you do not own. You have the right to remain silent." I watched from the front row, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply observed the inevitable conclusion of their choices. Chase the groom took a step back from Bianca, his face a mask of horror. He looked from the police to his parents seeking guidance, But Mrs. Sterling sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Then the man with the binder stepped forward. He was the bailiff, the physical arm of the judgment I had secured through Nemesis Holdings. He walked past my handcuffed parents and stopped directly in front of Bianca. She was trembling so violently, her bouquet was shaking apart, petals falling like snow onto the stone floor. Ms. Brooks, the bailiff, said, his voice flat and professional. I am acting on behalf of the creditor Nemesis Holdings. Due to the default on the fraudulently obtained loans and the subsequent court order issued this morning, all assets associated with the defendants are hereby seized. This includes the contents of the safe deposit boxes, the vehicles currently parked outside, and the personal property listed as collateral. Bianca tried to laugh, a hysterical bubbling sound. What does that have to do with me? She stammered. I am the bride. You can't seize anything here. This is my day. The bailiff opened his binder and pulled out a high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of the necklace currently around her neck. The South Sea pearls my grandmother had left to me. The pearls my mother had stolen. That brings me to the matter of evidence, he said, pointing a gloved finger at her throat. That necklace is listed as stolen property in active police file number 492. It is material evidence in the larceny case against your mother. You are in possession of stolen goods. Hand it over. Bianca clutched her throat, covering the pearls with her hand. No, she shrieked. You can't take this. It's an heirloom. It's mine. Hand it over, miss, or you will be charged with obstruction of justice and possession of stolen property, the detective warned, stepping away from my mother. Do not make us arrest the bride in front of the groom. The ultimatum hung in the air. Bianca looked at Chase, begging him with her eyes to intervene, to pay them off, to make it stop. But Chase did not move. He looked at the pearls, then he looked at me, sitting in my black dress, and then he looked back at the woman he was about to marry. He took another step back. With shaking hands, Bianca reached behind her neck. She fumbled with the clasp, her tears ruining her professional makeup. The clasp gave way. She held the shimmering strand out to the bailiff, who took it and placed it into an evidence bag. The sound of the plastic sealing shut was the final note of the ceremony. Her neck was bare, her parents were in chains, and the illusion was dead. Chase stood frozen at the altar, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, like a man who had just watched his entire world disintegrate into dust. The man who had been smiling 5 minutes ago looked like a statue cracking under pressure. He stared at the empty space on Bianca's neck, where the stolen pearls had been just moments before, and then at her face, which was now streaked with mascara and sheer panic. He looked at my parents being led away in handcuffs, their protests muffled by the heavy oak doors. He looked lost. It was time for the final mercy kill. I stood up from the front pew. My black dress rustled softly as I walked toward the altar, not as a sister, but as a prosecutor, delivering the closing argument to a jury that had already seen enough. I did not look at Bianca, who was hyperventilating near the flower arrangements. I looked directly at Chase. He turned his gaze to me, his eyes wide and pleading silently, asking for someone to tell him this was a nightmare he would wake up from. I stopped at the base of the steps. I pulled my phone from my clutch. I didn't need a microphone. The acoustics of the stone church carried sound perfectly, and the silence in the room was absolute. I tapped the screen. The recording I had captured during the coerced family meeting filled the sanctuary. The voices were unmistakable, high definition, and damning. My mother's sharp tone cut through the air first. Once the ring is on his finger, we are set for life. Vivian's voice sneered from the speaker. You just have to tolerate him and his dreadful mother for a few years, until the prenup vestment period ends. Then we take half and leave. Then came Bianca's voice, laughing, a cruel sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Chase is such a pushover, she said on the recording. He thinks I love him. I love his trust fund. And God, that mother of his, watches me like a hawk, but she is too old to stop us. We will put her in a home the second the ink is dry. A collective gasp swept through the pews like a physical wave. Mrs. Sterling stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Bianca lunged toward me, screaming that it was edited, that it was AI, that it was a lie, but the bailiff stepped in her path, blocking her with a solid wall of authority. Chase flinched as if he had been physically slapped, his face draining of all color. I stopped the recording. I reached into the leather folder I had been holding and pulled out a stack of stapled documents. I walked up the steps and held them out to Chase. He took them automatically, his hands shaking so hard the papers rattled. "These are the bank statements from the joint account you opened for the house down payment," I said, my voice calm and factual. "You thought the balance was $200,000. Look at the last page, Chase." Chase flipped the pages, his eyes scanning the lines of withdrawals. Wire transfers to offshore gaming sites, cash withdrawals at casinos in Atlantic City, payments to the hard money lender my parents had used to fund this very ceremony. The balance at the bottom was negative. "You emptied it," Chase whispered, his voice breaking. "The house fund, the money for our future. You gambled it away." Bianca sobbed, reaching for him, her hands grasping at his tuxedo jacket. "Baby, please let me explain. It was an investment. I was trying to double it for us. It just went wrong. I can fix it. I can make it back." Chase looked at her. The love that had been in his eyes 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute disgust. He looked at the woman who had mocked his family and stolen his money. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He reached for his left hand. He twisted the platinum band off his finger. He dropped it. It hit the stone floor with a sharp metallic ping that sounded louder than a scream in the silent church. "There is nothing to fix," he said, his voice dead. "Because there is no us. There never was." He turned his back on her. He walked down the steps past me, past the stunned guests, to where his mother stood. Mrs. Sterling adjusted her hat, looked at the empty doorway where my parents had been dragged out, and then looked at me. She nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement of the bullet I had helped them dodge. "Come, Chase," she said, her voice cutting through the sobbing of my sister. "We are leaving. And take the gifts." The entire Sterling side of the church rose in unison like a well-drilled army and marched out, leaving Bianca alone at the altar in a borrowed dress and a pile of lies. The heavy oak doors behind the Sterlings had barely clicked shut when the vacuum of silence in the sanctuary was filled by a sound so raw it made the remaining guests flinch. It started as a low, guttural growl in Bianca's throat and erupted into a scream that tore through the vaulted ceiling. She stood alone at the altar, a solitary figure in a borrowed gown, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making. The shock on her face had fractured into a kaleidoscope of pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't look at Chase's retreating back. She didn't look at our parents who were currently being read their Miranda rights by the altar rail. She looked at me. Her eyes were wild, bloodshot, and manic. The mask of the demure socialite had slipped, completely revealing the spoiled, vicious child underneath who had never been told no in her entire life. "You did this!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with the strain. "You ruined everything. You jealous, bitter hag. You couldn't stand to see me win. You poisoned him. You poisoned everyone. It is all your fault." She descended the marble steps, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She kicked off her satin heels, sending them skittering across the stone floor so she could move faster. She was coming for me. I stood my ground, my hands still clasping the leather folder that contained the evidence of her crimes. I did not retreat. I had spent 30 years retreating from her temper tantrums, backing down to keep the peace, absorbing her venom, so the family could pretend we were normal. Today, I was a stone wall. "I didn't destroy you, Bianca," I said, my voice calm and carrying in the echo chamber of the church. "The truth destroyed you. I just turned on the light." My words seemed to snap the last tether of her sanity. She lunged. It was a clumsy attack fueled by hysteria and adrenaline. Her fingers were curled into claws, reaching for my face, reaching to tear and hurt and scar. She wanted to erase the person who held the mirror up to her ugliness. I watched her come in slow motion. I saw the desperation in her eyes, the pathetic need to inflict pain because she could not process her own shame. I did not raise a hand to defend myself. I did not need to. I simply waited until she was within striking distance, and then I shifted my weight to the left. It was a small movement, a precise pivot I had learned in self-defense classes I took because I knew the world was dangerous even if I hadn't realized the danger lived in my own house. Bianca's momentum betrayed her. She stumbled past me, her hands grasping at empty air. Her bare feet slipped on the smooth stone floor. She flailed, trying to find purchase, trying to stop her forward motion, but gravity was the one law my parents couldn't bribe. She pitched forward, arms windmilling directly into the path of the wedding cake. It was a monstrosity of a confection, a 5-tier tower of vanilla and raspberry cream that had cost $12,000 paid for with the hard money loan. It stood on a table draped in white linen right at the base of the chancel steps. Bianca hit it with the force of a freight train. There was a sickening wet crunch as the structure gave way. The tower swayed for a fraction of a second, a leaning tower of sugar and lies, before collapsing entirely on top of her. White frosting exploded outward like shrapnel, coating the front pews, the stone floor, and the bride. The table buckled under her weight, sending silver cake servers and crystal champagne flutes crashing down around her. Bianca lay sprawled in the ruins of the dessert, gasping for air, covered head to toe in buttercream and fondant. The expensive designer gown she was wearing, the one she had rented because I had reclaimed my property, was decimated. The delicate lace was smeared with red raspberry filling that looked like arterial spray. The tulle was ripped, snagged on the edge of the table. I looked down at her. She was trying to wipe the frosting from her eyes, sputtering and coughing. The humiliation was absolute. It was a scene from a grotesque comedy. "That is a rental," I said, my voice cutting through her sobbing. "The deposit on that dress is $3,000. I checked your credit report, Bianca. You don't have it." Before she could respond, a commotion at the side entrance of the church drew my attention away from the sugar-coated disaster. The police were busy escorting my parents toward the main aisle, but 3 men had just entered through the vestry doors. They stopped at the edge of the sanctuary, scanning the room with cold, dead eyes. They were not guests. They were not police. They wore ill-fitting suits that strained across broad shoulders, and they carried an air of violence that chilled the room faster than the air conditioning. I recognized the type immediately from my years investigating financial fraud. These were the enforcement arm of the hard money lender. The loan sharks my father had visited in the pawn shop. They had come to collect. They saw the police. They saw the chaos. And then the leader, a man with a thick scar running through his eyebrow, locked eyes with my father. Marcus froze. The handcuffs on his wrists clicked as he tensed. The loan shark didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply tapped his wrist, where a watch would be, and then pointed a finger at the ground. The message was clear. Time was up. The collateral was gone. And the debt was now personal. The police officer shoved my father forward, breaking his stare. My mother began to wail again, a high, thin sound of despair, as she realized the social suicide was the least of her problems. They were led past me, the golden couple of Atlanta society, now reduced to prisoners in their own fantasy. As they passed my pew, my mother looked up. Her face was a ruin of tears, and terror mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. "Help us, Nia," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, you have money. Pay them off. Make this stop. We are your parents." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had stolen from me, who had lied to me, who had sold my future to buy a party for a daughter who was currently lying in a pile of cake. I looked at the handcuffs on her wrists. I looked at the loan sharks waiting in the shadows. I shook my head slowly. "I can't help you," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "I am just a secretary, remember. I don't have that kind of money." I watched them go, the heavy oak doors swallowing them whole, leaving only the scent of sugar and fear in the air. The police cars outside flashed their lights, painting the stained glass windows in strokes of blue and red. I turned back to the altar. Bianca was still on the floor, weeping into the ruins of her wedding cake alone. The loan sharks turned and exited the side door, silently disappearing, like ghosts to wait for my father's release. The check had bounced. The bill was due. And I was the only one walking out of there free. 3 months is a long time in the world of high society gossip, but it is a blink of an eye in the federal court system. Yet the case against Marcus and Vivian Brooks moved with unprecedented speed, largely because the evidence was so overwhelming it left no room for defense. I sat in the back of the federal courthouse, not as a daughter, but as a witness and a creditor, watching the final act of their tragedy unfold. They stood before the judge stripped of their finery, wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits that washed out their complexions. The arrogance that had defined them for decades was gone, replaced by a trembling fear that was pitiful to witness. The judge was not swayed by their tears or my mother's hysterics about being a pillar of the community. He saw the forensic audit I had provided. He saw the pattern of predatory behavior, the forgery, and the blatant theft. He sentenced them to 3 years in federal prison for mortgage fraud and aggravated identity theft. It was a light sentence by some standards, but for two people who had never spent a night without high thread count sheets, it was a death sentence. The gavel bang was the sound of their lives ending. But the prison time was only half of the punishment. The real devastation was financial. As the primary creditor, Nemesis Holdings exercised its right to seize all collateral. The foreclosure on the family home was finalized. The luxury cars were repossessed. The art on the walls, the designer furniture, even the contents of their jewelry boxes were cataloged and sold at auction to pay back the debts they had accrued. They went into prison with nothing, and they would come out with less than nothing. They were bankrupt in every sense of the word, financially, morally, and socially. Then there was Bianca. My sister did not go to prison. Her lawyer managed to secure a plea deal based on her lack of prior convictions and her cooperation in testifying against our parents regarding the mortgage fraud. She avoided a cell, but she did not avoid the consequences. She pleaded guilty to felony identity theft. The terms of her probation were strict. She was ordered to pay full restitution to me for the $50,000 she had stolen plus legal fees. She was also sentenced to 2,000 hours of community service. But the court of public opinion was far harsher than the legal system. The story of the wedding day raid had been splashed across every paper in Atlanta. The video of her screaming at the altar covered in cake had become a viral meme. The social circles she had desperately tried to impress did not just close ranks, they erased her. The Sterlings issued a public statement distancing themselves from the Brooks family, effectively branding them as pariahs. Her influencer friends blocked her number. She was radioactive. I drove through the city one rainy Tuesday afternoon to see the reality of her new life. I pulled into the parking lot of a fast food burger chain on the outskirts of town. Through the grease-streaked window I saw her. Bianca, the girl who had once refused to wear anything that wasn't designer, was wearing a polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair, which used to be professionally blown out 3 times a week, was pulled back under a hairnet. She was wiping down tables with a gray rag, her movements sluggish and resentful. I watched as a customer yelled at her for getting an order wrong. The old Bianca would have screamed back, she would have thrown a drink, she would have demanded to see a manager. This Bianca just shrank. She mumbled an apology, her shoulders hunched. She looked broken. She was working for minimum wage, trying to chip away at a debt mountain that would take her decades to climb. She was living in a studio apartment with 2 roommates taking the bus because her car had been seized. I did not go inside. I did not order a burger. I did not want to gloat to her face. Seeing her there scrubbing ketchup off a plastic tray was enough. It was the ultimate leveling. She had spent her life believing she was better than everyone else, that she was entitled to the world without working for it. Now she was learning the value of $1 the hard way. I put my car in reverse and drove away. I had a meeting with my architect to discuss the renovations on a historic property I had recently acquired. It was a beautiful colonial in the historic district. The previous owners had let it fall into disrepair, but it had good bones. I was going to make it mine. I was going to scrub the walls clean of their memories. I was going to plant new roses. I was finally taking back what was mine. The call came 3 weeks into their sentence. I was in my kitchen reviewing the blueprints for the solarium I was adding to the back of the house when my phone buzzed. It was a collect call from the Federal Correctional Institution. I stared at the screen for a long moment. A part of me, the part that had spent 30 years seeking approval, wanted to decline it. But the other part, the part that was now the architect of my own life, wanted to hear the sound of defeat. I accepted the charges. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable. Gone was the sharp, imperious tone of Vivian Brooks, the socialite who terrorized country club waiters. In its place was a whimpering, broken sound that grated on my ears. It was my mother begging. She told me she was dying in there. She told me the food was inedible. The bed was hard and the other inmates were terrifying. She told me she was sorry. She said the word sorry a dozen times, but it sounded less like an apology and more like a password she was trying to guess to unlock a safe. She wanted bail. She wanted an appeal lawyer. She wanted me to use the money I had made from her ruin to buy her freedom. I did not promise her anything on the phone. I simply said I would come to see her. I needed to do this in person. I needed to see the consequences of her greed with my own eyes. I needed closure not for her, but for the little girl she had left at the airport of emotional abandonment years ago. The prison visitation room was a study in gray. Gray walls, gray floors, gray tables bolted to the floor. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and stale sweat. I sat on a metal stool, my back straight, my hands folded on the table. When the guard brought her in, I almost didn't recognize her. Without the expensive dyes, her hair was a dull, streaky gray. Without the layers of foundation and contouring, her face was gaunt and lined with deep grooves of bitterness. She wore a baggy orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame. She looked small. She looked ordinary. She looked like exactly what she was, a criminal who had been caught. She sat down opposite me, reaching for the phone receiver on the wall. I picked up mine. The plexiglass between us was scratched and cloudy, but I could see the desperate hope in her eyes. She thought I was there to save her. She thought that because I had shown up, the old dynamic was back in place. She thought I was still the fixer. Nia. She breathed, her breath fogging the glass. Thank God you came. You have to get us out. Your father is not doing well. His heart, he cannot handle this place. And I am going crazy. Please, Nia, we learned our lesson. We know we were wrong. But 3 years is a death sentence. You have money. You have connections. Get us a new lawyer. Get us out on compassionate release. We will go anywhere. We will disappear. Just help us. I listened to her rambling pleas for 5 minutes. I listened to her blame the loan sharks, blame the economy, blame everyone but herself. I listened to her try to manipulate me with guilt, using the same old tools that were now rusty and useless. She called me her baby. She called me her smart girl. She tried to invoke the memory of family holidays that had been miserable for me, but perfect for her. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a single photograph. It was a high-resolution print on glossy paper. I held it up to the glass, pressing it flat so she could see every detail. It was a picture taken just yesterday. It showed me standing on the front lawn of the colonial house in the historic district. The house that used to be their pride and joy. The house they had fraudulently mortgaged. But it didn't look the same. I had painted the shutters a sleek modern black. I had ripped out the overgrown ivy they loved. I had replaced the old brass hardware with brushed nickel, and standing next to me, his arm possessively around my waist, was Dante. I was wearing a new dress, a structural masterpiece by a Japanese designer that cost more than my mother's bail bond would have. We looked powerful. We looked happy. We looked like the owners. My mother squinted at the photo, and then her eyes went wide. Before I reveal what I did next, comment just one number one so I know you're still here. And a quick note. The next part of this story includes some dramatized elements and may not be entirely factual, so if you'd rather not continue, this is the moment to stop watching. She recognized the porch. She recognized the columns. But she also recognized that her touch had been erased from the property entirely. I bought it back from the bank. I said, my voice calm and amplified by the phone line. I got a great deal on a foreclosure. It is my house now. I turned your sewing room into a walk-in closet, and we burned the furniture. Her mouth fell open. A sound of pure anguish escaped her throat. You took our home, she whispered. I did not take it, I corrected her. You lost it. You bet it on a lie and the house won. She started to cry again, ugly sobbing tears that smeared on the glass. How can you be so cruel, she wailed. I am your mother. I chose you. We adopted you. We gave you a name. You chose me to be an accessory, I said. You chose me to be the funding source for your golden child. You made a choice every single day for 30 years. You chose Bianca. You chose her comfort over my safety. You chose her vanity over my dignity. You chose her wedding over my future. I leaned forward, my eyes locking with hers. You made your investment, mother. You put all your equity into Bianca. You gave her the love, you gave her the attention, you gave her the stolen money. So you should ask for a return on that investment. I stood up, the metal stool scraping against the floor. But she has no money, my mother pleaded, slamming her hand against the glass. She is working at a burger joint. She is broke. She can't help us. Exactly, I said. You bet on the wrong horse, and now you are both bankrupt. I looked at her one last time. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cool, clean sensation of a balance sheet that had finally been reconciled. You chose Bianca, I repeated, my voice final. Now let her bail you out. I hung up the phone. The click was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I didn't look back as I walked toward the heavy steel door. I could hear her screaming my name muffled by the thick glass, but I didn't stop. I walked out of the prison and into the bright Atlanta sun where my husband and my life were waiting for me. I blocked the number on my phone before I even reached the car. The account was closed. The house was alive. It was not the frantic performative energy of my parents' parties, where laughter was a currency and every conversation was a transaction. This was the warm, steady hum of genuine connection. It was 6 months since the trial, and Dante and I were hosting our first housewarming in the property I had reclaimed from the ashes of my parents' fraud. We had gutted the interior. The heavy, oppressive velvet drapes that smelled of my mother's cloying perfume were gone, replaced by sheer linen that caught the afternoon light. The dark wood paneling in the study where my father had plotted his schemes had been painted a crisp, clean white. It was the same address, but a different world. I stood in the foyer greeting guests. These were not social climbers or people looking for a loan. They were my attorney who had fought for me in court. They were the friends who had sat in the empty pews at my wedding. They were Dante's colleagues who respected me for my mind, not my pedigree. I caught my reflection in the antique mirror by the door. The woman staring back was unrecognizable from the bride who had stood alone in the St. Regis ballroom. I was wearing emerald green, a color my mother had always forbidden me to wear, because she said it was too bold. It fit perfectly. But the most important detail was around my neck. The South Sea pearls. The police had returned them to me in an evidence bag still dusted with fingerprint powder. I had them professionally cleaned and restrung. They felt cool and heavy against my skin, a weight that was no longer a burden, but a crown. They were back where they belonged, not on the neck of a thief, but on the granddaughter who had earned them. Dante came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. He looked at our reflection in the mirror, his dark eyes full of pride. "You look like you own the place," he whispered. I leaned back into him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest. "I do," I said, "in every way that matters." The party moved to the backyard where we had ripped out the pretentious English garden my mother had installed on credit and replaced it with a modern patio and a fire pit. I watched my friends laughing, eating the food I had paid for with honest money in a house that was secure. There were no liens, there were no secrets, there was just us. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out instinctively. It was a text message from an unknown number. I didn't recognize the digits, but I recognized the tone immediately. The preview flashed on the lock screen. "Naya, please pick up. It is cold and I have nowhere to go. I am your sister. Just answer me." I stared at the words. A year ago, a text like that would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. I would have been in the car before I finished reading it, rushing to save Bianca from the consequences of her own actions. I would have fixed it because that was what I was trained to do. But I wasn't that person anymore. Bianca was not a victim. She was an adult who had made a series of catastrophic choices. Her cold was a result of the bridges she had burned. Her isolation was the house she had built. I didn't feel a spike of adrenaline. I didn't feel the old tug of obligation. I felt a profound, quiet stillness. I swiped my thumb across the screen. Delete. Then I tapped the info icon. Block caller. The phone went dark. I slipped it back into my pocket as if it were nothing more than a receipt for a bill I had already paid. I walked out onto the patio, joining the circle of warmth around the fire. Dante handed me a glass of wine, his eyes asking a silent question. I smiled and shook my head. It was handled. I looked up at the night sky above Atlanta. The stars were bright and clear. I thought about the empty tables at my wedding, the silence that had felt so deafening at the time. I realized now that silence wasn't an insult. It was a clearing. It was the universe making space for the life I was meant to have. I took a sip of wine and let the truth settle into my bones. They didn't come to my wedding, I thought, looking around at the beautiful, safe life I had built. That was the greatest gift they ever gave me. Their absence is my peace. And to you, listening to this story, remember, this nothing about what happened made me extraordinary. I did not suddenly become stronger, wiser, or more deserving than anyone else. I did not unlock some hidden power or transform overnight into a different person. What changed was quieter, slower, and far more painful. I reached a moment where staying silent cost more than finally telling the truth, and once I crossed that line, there was no returning to the version of myself who believed endurance was the same thing as love. For most of my life, I thought patience was virtue. I believed that if I stayed useful, if I absorbed discomfort quietly, if I fixed problems that were never mine to solve, harmony would eventually arrive. I told myself that loyalty meant endurance, and that love required sacrifice without limit. It never worked. What I lived through was not one dramatic act of cruelty. It was family betrayal repeated in small, normalized ways until it felt almost reasonable to accept being last. This kind of family betrayal rarely begins with something obvious. It starts when your needs are labeled inconvenient, when your boundaries are treated like suggestions, and when your value is measured only by what you can provide, rather than who you are. Over time, those small dismissals form patterns. Patterns harden into systems, and systems only collapse when the cost of maintaining them becomes unbearable. I want to be honest about what followed. What I carried out was family revenge. It brought consequences that were deserved, but it also carried a weight I would never wish on anyone. Accountability may stop harm, but it does not automatically heal the damage done inside you. Even when you are right, even when the truth is undeniable, there is an emotional cost that lingers long after the conflict ends. There were nights I lay awake asking myself whether I had gone too far, whether I had become something I never wanted to be. In those moments, I prayed not for punishment, but for clarity. I asked God whether choosing myself meant I had failed at loving others. What I learned changed me forever. God does not ask us to destroy ourselves in order to prove love. Faith does not require silence in the face of harm. If you are listening and thinking, "This could never happen to me," please hear me clearly, neither did I. No one plans devastation. It grows slowly through compromises, through excuses, through telling yourself that it is not serious enough yet. That is how family betrayal survives, because hope and fear are allowed to coexist in the same space. I do not want you to follow my path all the way to the end. Learn earlier. Speak sooner. Set boundaries before resentment becomes your fuel. Family revenge should never be the goal. It should only ever be the final boundary when every other attempt at honesty and protection has failed, and even then it leaves scars. For a long time, I confused forgiveness with access. I believed grace meant tolerating harm without change. But faith is not endless endurance. Later in the silence, after everything collapsed, I finally understood something I wish I had known sooner. God does not ask us to stay where we are being broken. Walking away is not weakness. Sometimes it is obedience. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell her, "This do not be like me. Do not wait until anger is the only thing holding you upright. Do not confuse usefulness with worth. Do not let loyalty become a leash that tightens every time you try to breathe. You do not need proof worthy of a courtroom to justify protecting your peace. Shared blood does not guarantee shared values. Being related to someone does not entitle them to your time, your energy, your resources, or your future. When people accuse you of changing after you finally set boundaries, what they often mean is that you stop being convenient. Not every loss is a failure. Some losses are necessary corrections. I spent years believing that being indispensable would make me safe. It did not. Indispensability is not love. It is dependency disguised as affection. When people disappear from your life after you stop overgiving, their absence is not proof that you were wrong. It is proof that the relationship depended on imbalance to survive. Silence is powerful, but only when it is chosen. Silence forced on you is suppression. Silence chosen by you is clarity. Walking away does not always require confrontation or spectacle. Sometimes it is as quiet as not answering the phone, not explaining yourself one final time, not reopening doors that only ever led to pain. Yes, family revenge ended the harm, but boundaries are what prevented it from starting again. Boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions for how you will be treated. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries will always resist them. Let them. Growth often looks like betrayal to those who were comfortable with your silence. I once asked why the people who raised me seemed determined to break me. I wondered if love was supposed to hurt this much. In that questioning, I finally found peace. God was not absent in the collapse. He was present in the permission to leave in the quiet space where something healthier could finally grow. Healing did not arrive as relief. It arrived as responsibility. Responsibility to myself. Responsibility to stop repeating patterns that demanded my suffering. Responsibility to choose peace over approval. I learned that rebuilding your life after betrayal is not about replacing people. It is about rebuilding trust with yourself. I also learned something uncomfortable. Not everyone who hurts you is doing it consciously. Some people wound others because they have never examined themselves. That does not excuse the harm, but it explains why waiting for awareness or remorse can keep you trapped for decades. Family betrayal often hides behind phrases like "they didn't mean it" or "they had good intentions." Intent does not erase impact. There were moments when I wished I had handled things differently. Not because the truth was wrong, but because I waited so long that the only language left was consequence. I do not glorify family revenge. I see it now as the cost of delayed boundaries. If I had spoken earlier, if I had chosen discomfort sooner, the ending might not have required such finality. Faith played a complicated role in my journey. For years, I used God as a reason to stay. I told myself that patience was holy and that endurance was righteous. What I failed to understand was that God values truth as much as grace. Love without truth becomes manipulation. Forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. I am not proud of how far things went. I am at peace with why they did. There is a difference. Peace does not mean absence of regret. It means absence of denial. I stopped pretending that what hurt me was acceptable simply because it came from people who shared my blood. If you see yourself in this story, please hear this gently. You do not need to burn your life down to justify leaving. You do not need evidence, witnesses, or approval. If something is costing you your dignity, your safety, or your sense of self, that is reason enough. The most dangerous lie I believed was that love meant endurance. Real love does not require you to disappear. Real faith does not demand you stay silent while being harmed. God does not confuse obedience with self-destruction. I learned to forgive without reconnecting. I learned to pray without returning. I learned that distance can be an act of love not just for yourself, but for the version of others who might one day face their own reflection. When people say, "but they are family," what they often mean is, "I am uncomfortable with your boundaries." You are not responsible for preserving illusions that were built at your expense. You are not cruel for choosing peace. You are not ungrateful for refusing to be consumed. There is life after betrayal. It is quieter. It is less dramatic. It does not require constant proof. It feels strange at first, like standing in silence after years of noise. But that silence is not emptiness. It is space. Space to hear your own thoughts. Space to rebuild trust with yourself. Space to learn that your worth was never dependent on how much you could endure. If I could leave you with one truth, it is this: do not wait until anger is your only language. Speak when your voice still shakes. Set boundaries while you can still do so with compassion. Because once everything collapses, rebuilding requires more than courage, it requires mourning. I mourned the family I thought I had. I mourned the version of myself who believed love had to hurt. And then slowly I began to build something else. Something honest. Something quiet. Something real. Before I end this story, there is one more truth I need to say out loud, because silence is how this all survived for so long. For years I believed that if I endured quietly, I was being mature. If I stayed calm, I was being faithful. If I kept fixing what others broke, I was being loving. But endurance without limits does not make you noble, it makes you invisible. And invisibility is where harm thrives. I used to think strength meant holding everything together. Now I know real strength is knowing when to let things fall. There is a grief that comes with that realization, because when you stop holding the weight, you also lose the illusion that things could have been different if you had just tried harder. That illusion is painful to release, but it is also freeing. I had to accept that some people are not capable of meeting you where you are, no matter how much you love them. Not because you failed, but because they benefit from you staying small. That realization does not come with relief at first. It comes with sadness, confusion, and an uncomfortable loneliness. But over time, that loneliness becomes peace. I also had to forgive myself for staying too long, for explaining too much, for believing that suffering was a requirement for love. God did not condemn me for leaving. He met me in the quiet after, where I finally learned to rest without fear of being needed, used, or diminished. If you are still listening, please hear this with compassion. You do not need to reach a breaking point to justify choosing yourself. You do not need to be betrayed publicly or hurt dramatically to earn the right to step away. If something feels wrong, if your spirit feels heavy, if love feels like obligation instead of safety, that is already enough. I do not tell this story to encourage destruction. I tell it to encourage awareness. I do not want you to become hardened the way I had to. I want you to choose earlier, softer, and wiser. Learn from my delay. Learn from my silence. Do not wait until pain forces your hand. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part stayed with you the longest or what boundary you wish you had set sooner. If stories like this help you reflect, heal, or feel less alone, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to the channel for more reflections like this. Thank you sincerely for staying with me all the way to the end. And one final gentle warning before you go: future stories on this channel may include dramatized or fictionalized elements created for educational purposes, reflection, and exploring difficult truths. If that is not something you wish to hear, please feel free to step away and choose content that better aligns with you.